there's this very adversarial relationship to technology, to platforms, right? What lands up happening is that you always have a defensive stance to technology rather than, so when we're talking about deep fakes, we're saying, oh my gosh, women are going to be affected by AI generated news. And that is correct. Like 98% of content that's deepfake content is pornographic content. But women can also use this technology to create content. And so I think for me, one of the big shifts that needs to happen is that for us to stop being so defensive about all of this and saying, like, no, this is something that's useful for me in my day to day life. And then move up from there to say, like, okay, how do I build more with this?
Technology empowers and oppresses us at the same time. Technology can be used as a weapon against you, especially if you're a woman. Tattle is one of India's civic tech organizations that use AI to create tools aimed at debunking deepfakes and helping women deal with offensive, misogynistic online content. In this new episode of AI-FLUENT, together with Tattle's co-founder Tarunima Prabhakar, we think aloud about the future of AI in addressing harmful online content, gender-based violence in India, and Tarunima's own take on how to make technology more equitable and more human. Tarunima, thank you so much. I'm glad that we finally managed to sit down and have a conversation. So, what is Tattle? How would you describe your brainchild in one sentence?
Tattle is a civic tech organization. And what we do is that we build technology, which can include data sets, and includes scrapers, it includes machine learning tools to amplify civic response to online harms. So that's Tattle in one line.
What is the role of civic tech organizations in India? How do you see it?
Yeah, so I think, civic tech, different people define it differently. A lot of people would define civic tech as engaging or increasing citizens' access to public services. The way we look at it is that what's happening with a lot of changing technologies is that the relationship between citizens and the state, citizens and the private sector is rapidly evolving. In this evolving space, we want to build technology that carves more space out for citizens to reclaim agency, to reclaim power in affecting or in changing how they are being affected by digital systems. So that's how we define civic tech, but I think a lot of different organizations would define it differently.
So let me ask, because I wanted to also clarify the name tattle, because tattle is a verb that means to secretly tell someone in authority that someone else had done something wrong, but it can also be used as a noun to describe idle talk or gossip. That's why we have a magazine, Tattler. So what was your thinking behind when you decided to name your organization Tattle?
Yeah, I think, again, quite deliberate in that there's a big thrust on talking about disinformation and, that there is intentional spreading of propaganda. And all of that is true. But when you think about closed messaging apps, a lot of what is happening is people, very well-intentioned, everyday people, sending content from one friend to another, from one group to a family group. And that to us was the behavior, or like that's a space where we wanted to intervene, which is that when everyday people who are quite well-intentioned would not think of themselves as gullible, are spreading a fair bit of misinformation and spreading also polarizing content. How do you intervene in that? And that's why it's Tattle. I think this is a line that we have been quite clear on, that yes, while disinformation is important, that's not our primary area of intervention. We're not trying to find out who spread inaccurate content. Often that is quite clear, like especially when it comes from people in power, it's very clear where that content came from. But I think the question is, how do you get the consumers to be more discerning, and how do you get the consumers to be more resilient?
So one of your first projects was aimed at helping women deal with harmful online content. And it's no surprise to me, of course, why you started with gender-based online violence. It's prevalent in many places around the world, but to my understanding, it's almost endemic in India. I've stayed in India for over a month now and talked to many women from different strata of society. They all have the explanations for the roots of this normalized violence and abuse. If we look beyond patriarchy and traumatic historical events, which actually many countries in the world went through, what is your explanation and understanding of the problem? Why is there so much violence in India aimed at women?
That's a very difficult question. It's a deep sociological question, and I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer why patriarchy or why violence against women and gender minorities is so deep in India. I think what I would sort of direct, or where I think I have more expertise, is in commenting on the specific online manifestation of it. We've seen this with women who are visible, who are outspoken in the course of our work. We've spoken to stand-up comics, we've spoken to people who are campaigners, we've spoken to activists, and I think there is idea that women in public life in some ways like should be penalized for being public, right? So like for that act of stepping out or for the act of becoming visible, women are penalized. And so and this is something that's also that we're observing with in the more rural context, in the context of intimate imagery, which is that woman who might have put her photograph on a WhatsApp display picture, that image is now sufficient to morph that image, to convert it to, to create sexualized imagery out of it. And so even that degree of visibility and publicness gets penalized. And that has a lot to do with entrenched social behaviors. And I think my fear and our effort is to actually ensure that when we say that there is a digital revolution, that revolution enables us to reduce that gap and not make it worse, right? Not make it worse for women. How do you use technology to actually make it better? And in some ways, maybe bridge some of the existing social inequities.
Yeah, it's a big question, by the way, that because in a way, technology does empower us, but it also does control us and does, in some cases, actually takes this power back. We'll talk about this maybe a bit later. I would like us to talk about two of your different projects, ULI and Deepfake Analysis Unit. But first, let me ask you more general questions from a technical perspective about how these tools work. So how does Tattle leverage AI and machine learning to identify and combat abusive or harmful online content? What are the key technical challenges in building such systems?
There are two very clear aspects on the technical side, right? One is the data collection challenge, which is that technically it's actually quite difficult to collect content from closed messaging apps like WhatsApp. And then there is also the ethical question, because on Twitter and Reddit, at least before we had this Gen AI boom and most of the platforms closed off their APIs, researchers were able to collect data from some of the more open social media platforms. So when it comes to closed messaging apps, it's still a big challenge how you enter those spaces, how you collect information, how do you understand what's happening in them. So a big part of our work is actually just on data collection, which is whether it's writing tools for closed messaging apps or for open platforms. Then the other aspect is how do you make sense of all of this data? And that's where machine learning plays a big role, because when we're talking at the scale of social media and messaging apps, there's a lot of content and it's not possible to manually go through all of it. And that's where we invest and build machine learning tools that help you analyze multilingual and multimodal content. And so these are open source tools, and our idea is that it's the baseline suite of tools that any academic, any journalist, any practitioner can use, so that then they spend more time doing the analysis rather than writing the tools to do the analysis, right? For us, that was the baseline sort of that was a vision for creating this baseline set of tools that are useful for everybody. And then, like you mentioned, we've delved a lot deeper because of some of the machine learning work. When we started building a tool called Feluda, which was just to analyze content that looks visually similar, content that might be talking about similar things. I think from there, we also realized that actually detection of abusive content in Indian languages, there were no tools for that. And the reason why we reached that realization was because in our own work, when we were collecting so much content from social media and we wanted to open some of these data sets, we realized that in absence of some of these tools, a lot of this data that contained harmful content, we could not parse it because there was so much abusive content, and we needed to filter it out before we opened any of these data sets. So that's how we realized that, okay, we actually need detection tools, not only platforms. I think all of us, and this includes small businesses that might be running a chat bot for a grocery store, like a lot of different businesses, researchers, yeah, everyone needs a baseline set of tools that detects abuse in their languages. And that's how we eventually also forayed into the project that you were mentioning called Uli.
As online platforms grow, so does the volume of harmful content. How do you guys ensure that your AI tools can scale effectively to handle large amounts of data without compromising accuracy?
I think we're not, because we're again building technology for civil society groups, for fact checking groups. We don't have to deal with the challenge of scale that platforms have to deal with. So, for example, when we run, say, ULI or the Deepfake Analysis Unit, with all of these projects, there's a fair bit of data that comes, and then we do sort of engineering tweaks, right? And we, for example, might not use the biggest models. We might actually use smaller models because it gets us 90% of the way there, and that's enough for what we are trying to do. So we're not at the frontier of AI where we need very large infrastructure and we need very high accuracy, because at the end of it, what we're also saying is that you always need humans in the loop to go through the data to make final decisions. I think in the context of Uli, which is our project, so it's now a four-year project.
Wait a second. So, yes, Uli. So, first of all, what a beautiful word. And I've learned that it's a Tamil word, right? And in Tamil, Uli means what? Chisel.
Yes.
Maybe when you start talking about Uli, we will understand why did you name it like this. So this is your browser extension. How does it work? And can it be used only with X, former Twitter, or other social media platforms as well?
So Uli is actually more than just the browser plugin. I can give a bigger picture of this project, right? So as I was mentioning, because we realize that there is a lack of detection capabilities of abusive content in Indian languages, we wanted to step into that space. So in 2021, we started by looking at specifically online misogyny, because as you rightly pointed out, it is one of the deepest problems in terms of online harms. Women and marginalized genders are disproportionately targeted in India and elsewhere. And so, because we were doing this outside of platforms, we had the opportunity of going to people who are at the receiving end of abuse and asking them, what do you think is abusive online? Right. And so then we're not talking to the average person on the internet. We are talking to people who are survivors, people who face it on a day-to-day basis. And perhaps unsurprisingly, their view of what constitutes abuse online is very different from the average person on the internet who's just lurking, has probably never engaged on a online debate, right? And also because for a lot of them, they encounter abuse over 1 year, 2 years. Like it's these are long episodes, and so their perception of abuse is quite different. And so we built a machine learning. So we built a data set of online abuse in 3 Indian languages: Hindi, Tamil, and Indian English. And we trained a machine learning model based on the data set that this group of experts who are activists, academics, researchers, who have either had lived experience of gendered abuse or have worked with people who have lived experience of gendered abuse, right? So they created this data set and we trained a machine learning model to detect abuse on it. But there were a lot of other things we did in the process, because we knew, even when we were doing this work, that machine learning models will always make decisions, will always make mistakes, right? There is never a perfect model that will get abuse detection 100% correct. And secondly, unlike, say, object identification, which is also a use of AI, where AI is trying to detect what are the objects in this image, where is a cat in this image, right? Their question of accuracy makes a lot of sense. But when we're talking about something like abuse, it's very subjective, it's very contextual. And so people will often disagree with the decisions of the models, right? And so that's why we always knew that this idea of detecting abuse and redacting was always only going to be one part of the overall set of solutions that people had at people could access. And so what we were also doing with the browser plugin, of course, one of the things that we did was to deploy this machine learning model through the browser plugin, so that any tweet that was, we started with Twitter, any tweet that was detected to be abused would be redacted from a person's feed so that they would not see it. But some of the other things that we've done is it actually only redacts abusive words from any website, actually. So if it's installed on your browser, it does it for every word that has been detected as abusive. But it also gives people the option of archiving content, because something we'd heard from folks was that when they want to report instances of abuse, they don't have the evidence to give to law enforcement. Often they don't have the evidence to give to platforms. Either the platforms have taken down the content or the perpetrators taken down the content, right? Over the last 4 years, we've continued to grow the data sets, and we've heard needs from, for example, university professors saying that, I like that content is redacted, but I want my students to know why what they are saying is problematic. It's not just enough to say that this is bad, but I think so what they want to engage their students in understanding why something is bad. And so then Uri now has also grown. That's one of the things it does now, is like we've been doing workshops with universities for the plugin to be a way for people to engage more critically with the content they're seeing online.
Because when I started to kind of to play with this Uli, so what my understanding was that so it basically kind of blurs this offensive language from my feed. But by blurring it, it doesn't mean that this online violence is stopped. It's almost like you're closing your eyes on this, and that's in a way can be misleading in a way, right? You're closing your eyes as if it doesn't exist, but it does exist.
Yeah, I think that's a fair criticism. And I think, again, to be very sober about what Uli does and it does not do, right? So it is a very survivor-centered tool. And the idea is that if I don't want to engage with content, so if you think of it from the perspective of many people who are online, they've come to a realization where they say that, well, no matter what we do, no matter, however we report to law enforcement, we report to platforms, a lot of this content is not going to stop, right? And so they want to sort of take their attention to the content that they want to engage with and not see some of this hateful troll like content that they, that doesn't help them at all, and they feel like they don't really have agency over it. So I think that is the limit of, in some ways, what Uli does. I think for us, the more sort of campaign building advocacy side of the tool is that when multiple people say archive something, or when multiple people find something that's problematic, how do you use that to rally the platforms or law enforcement to actually act on that content, right? So I think that's the collective action power that Uri has. But I think on the redaction side, I think there are very clear limits to what it achieves. I think the other aspect of our work is to realize that there are limits to say a browser plugin, because most of our stakeholders are using social media on their mobile phones, and browser plugins don't work on their mobile phones. And there's actually almost no great way of building something like Uli for a mobile phone without impinging on people's privacy. And so what has also happened is that we've had to engage more deeply with platforms as a consequence and say that, okay, these are words and this is content that people find offensive. Your platform is not doing a good job of taking it down. Can you please act on it? Right? So that has also now become sort of a space of advocacy, because we do realize that there are very clear limits to what Uri can do.
Yes, you can't do everything, and it's absolutely honest, I think, to admit your limitations as well and say, this is a limit, and we work within this kind of parameters. So yes, I was also wondering, you see that many women in India, especially in rural areas, may lack the kind of tech savviness to use tools like Uli. So how does Tattle ensure that its solutions are accessible to women with varying levels of digital literacy?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. So, like I mentioned, that there are limits to where Uri can and cannot be used. But even in the course of the last 4 years, we've engaged with people from all sections of society. We've engaged with folks who only use social media in their native language and do not use, for example, Twitter. It was notorious for this, would not use Twitter in English. So when Twitter had that help center option, which was only available in English, right? A lot of these people didn't realize that they had the option of reporting content, right? Because like some of these support documents were not available in their languages. So some of the things we have done are around translating these content or platform policies, creating guides in regional languages. And then also in the course of our work, when we conduct workshops, for example, we continue to crowdsource words in Indian languages that are problematic, because a lot of these words change with time, language changes. Yeah, what is problematic changes. People might reclaim a problematic word and change its meaning. And so when we do these workshops, I think a lot of people, for example, will only join on their, they join via their phones. They They're not very comfortable with Google Sheets. They're not very comfortable with, let alone some custom dashboard that we build, right? I think then it comes down to engaging with them on mediums that they are comfortable with, which is that we might tell them, okay, can you send us these words on WhatsApp? And then we will add it to a sheet, right? And then the medium of communication is also very important. And that's where role of translation, which is that you have to have like one word in the one foot in the machine learning world, but at the same time, you have to be able to communicate everything that's happening in very accessible language, in regional languages, right? And so all of that is a way of making this work accessible.
So you have a completely different project called Deepfake Analysis Unit, and on this one you collaborate with fact checkers and forensic experts. How does it work and what it is about?
When I said that Tattle is a civic tech organization, one of our long-standing dreams was to actually increase the reach of fact-checking efforts to the average person using the internet. So early, I think somewhere around late 2023, there was a big concern around AI and synthetic content. Last year, there was 60 plus elections globally, and India also had a national election. So this was a project that I think was very timely, and it came about due to a number of different factors in a very short period. But I think we were seeing the election, it happened last year in March, and we were seeing, we were seeing it approach us slowly, and also seeing this big threat of AI generated content. And so Misinformation Combat Alliance, which is this alliance of 11 fact checking groups in India, we're also a part of it, decided that let's create this collaborative effort where fact checkers will do what they do best, but also combine it with the technical forensics techniques, which is just using machine learning automated tools to detect whether some content is forged, and to marry those two approaches to make it faster to respond to deepfakes and synthetic media. So in March of last year, we basically launched this WhatsApp number where people could send any content that they thought was AI generated. And then fact checkers as well. So the Deepfake Analysis Unit would look at that content, would escalate it to fact checkers, would escalate it to technical forensic partners, and basically try and provide very speedy responses to the people who were interacting with them on WhatsApp. Since then, the Deepfake Analysis Unit, as we later discovered, was also being used by fact checkers in other countries. They were actually sending content on WhatsApp because it was turning out to be a very effective model. So Tattle is maintaining the WhatsApp pipeline, but also the dashboard. And where, again, AI plays a role there is increasing the efficacy of all of this work. So because when a piece of content goes viral, multiple people will send that same media item to the tip line. So fact checkers should not have to look at it twice or three times, right? Like they should just respond to that content once, and then every time someone else sends that content, they should just get the same reply that the first person got. So that's one of the places where machine learning is being used. Similarly, spam detection, which is that there's a lot of spammy content on some of these tip lines. That's another place where machine learning plays a role. So again, I think keeping in line with our mission, we are building tech that actually makes it faster for fact checkers to do their job. And then I think some of the work, because again, this is now a one-year project, some of the things that have emerged is that deepfake detection tools work great again on English language content. But when you have Indian, speeches from politicians in India, and it's often just audio notes, there's no video to go with it, it becomes really hard to detect. And because a lot of these detection tools are not trained or are not tailored to detect content in these languages. And so now that's another sort of stream of work that's emerging, is that how do you actually improve the capabilities of some of these detection tools to work better in non-English, low-resource languages.
I can imagine that this kind of tool, like Deepfake Analysis Unit, is very popular during, I don't know, elections, for example, right, when people really want to verify things. But now, let's say, no elections, no major events in India, and let's say I want to use, I read certain things online, and not necessarily from any media organization, but via friends on social media platforms, and I want to check some information. So can I still send something on WhatsApp group? How will it work if I want to use it now and check what I think might be a miss or disinformation?
Yeah, the Deepfake Analysis Unit is very much alive. It's still a fairly detailed, or it's just a project that's still going in full swing. In fact, I think this week the Deepfake Analysis Unit opened itself to fact checkers globally formally and said, they can be a resource for others as well. What was observed post the election season was that there were a lot of financial scams, right? So, for example, business leaders, politicians, selling people all sorts of scams. So that's one aspect of it. And then again, a lot of deepfakes, AI generated content targeting celebrities, women in the public eye. So that's the other category. And all of that content has stayed. And we've had state elections. There might not be massive global elections, but it's not as if the use of synthetic media in campaigning has stopped. So yes, the Deepfake Analysis Unit is still up and running. It's quite robust. You can go on the site dau.mcaindia.com, I want to say, not in. There's a WhatsApp number there. You can just send a number on the WhatsApp channel. There's also an email thread. So if people want to escalate things via email, that might also be an option.
What about collaborations in general? So do you collaborate with other civic organizations? I don't know, Safe City, because Safe City is a kind of initiative of the government in a way, right, in India. So, or any international civic organizations who work in this field. Who are your main partners, or with whom do you collaborate in this area?
I think so. Yeah, since the beginning of our work in 2019, I think we might have collaborated with more than 15 organizations. I want to say formally, informally, within the ULI project, right? If you look at the original dataset paper, that paper has 18 plus authors, and all the 18 people who created that data set are from different organizations. So there's Khabar Leheria, or Chambal Media, which runs a newspaper that is, it's a newsroom that's run by women in rural India. So there's Chambal Media, there's professors from Delhi University, there is Point of View in Mumbai, there's Rati Foundation, which runs helpline they call it a trust line for children and young adults who've been affected by CSAM or NCII. So they provide psychosocial legal support. There's feminism in India. I'm almost a little afraid that I will forget or I will not be able to name all of them. I absolutely wouldn't be. Nazaria, which is a group for LGBTQI communities in India. Yeah, and more recently, for example, we were doing some work on safety benchmarks, which is like how do you ensure that the new AI systems, large language models, don't produce outputs that encourage sex-related crimes or that endorse sex-related crimes or misogyny, right? And so even in that context, Monk Prayogshala, which is a behavioral psychology group in Mumbai, so then, and a couple of psychologists, Alt Story in Bangalore. So yes, the list is so long. I'll have to send all of it. It's a lot of people, right? But I think that's what I love about, in some ways, about our work and about being able to do this work is that, tech needs to be cross-disciplinary. It's not as if it's engineers just sitting in a room thinking of solutions. When you want technology to actually work, and sort of it has to be thoughtfully embedded in the social context.
And you also work with journalists, right? But with journalists, I think you work mainly for your deepfake analysis unit, right? So,
but even in the context of ULI, so like I mentioned, Khabar Leheria, it's a newsroom run by women in rural India. We also had, more sort of English-speaking journalists as a part of that work as well, because journalists do understand online harms. Fact checkers also, for example, because they've looked at so much content, understand. So yes, they're absolutely a key part of our community, whether it is with the ULI project or whether it's to respond to misogyny or in the context of Deepfake Analysis Unit.
But does Tattle work directly with social media platforms or other online spaces to implement your tools? And if so, what are the biggest challenges in getting these platforms to adapt your solutions?
Yeah, so we engage with platforms. We have conversations with them, is what I'll say. And, whatever we learn from our community, our findings, we will relay them often to platforms, either when they do their closed door discussions or sometimes when there are open calls that government might put out, right? Like they'll ask for public feedback on certain regulations and proposals. So all of our research findings inform how we engage with both platforms and governments. I think one very concrete example is, for example, Meta on Instagram has this feature called Hidden Words, which is that if you enable that feature, then posts or comments that contain those words are hidden, right? And actually, the UDI data set just contributes to that quite clearly, because even when you have this hidden words feature, I as an Instagram user might not at the top of my head know all the words that are problematic, right? When I encounter it, I know it, but I'm not going to have that list. But because we have that list, it's something that we advocate to people, and we say, you can use this to block out some of this content. So yeah, I think there are ways in which some of our work dovetails neatly with platform features, and very often it does not, right? Very often our work is to tell platforms that what you're doing is not working, basically.
I was wondering, Tarunima, so what is your what is your view on this collaboration? Because you are tech and civic, right? You're tech organization as well. So you, of course, you work with some big tech companies, even for fact checking with Meta and all that. But in the light what is happening now with this big tech, when they become increasingly partisan, when they basically pledging their allegiance to Trump's administration and all that. How do you feel that even for your organization, when you are tech and civic and all that, but I don't know, to receive any support or to collaborate with these big organizations, can it become a reputational liability for you? How does it feel?
Yeah, that's interesting. So, while this collusion in some ways of industry and government is becoming very clear in the context of the US now, I think this was the case in many other countries long before 2024, right? And so I think from our vantage point, we always felt that in the definition of civic tech, we're saying that we want to carve out more space for citizen action. And that's again both carving out space from industry and carving out space for government. Because in a lot of contexts, and also in India, I think there was a lot more dovetailing between what the government and platforms were doing. And a lot of the free speech posturing that we were seeing in the US was not something that you definitely, you're seeing in a lot of other countries. So I think what has been interesting for us is actually going in the opposite direction, which is that we, yeah, we very strongly try to keep ourselves independent of pressures from both sides. But specifically with say Uli and some of this data set work that we started doing, we realized that there were limits to what you could do, and so you do have to engage with platforms, right? And then the question is on what terms. So, for example, we don't have any contracts with platforms where we've had to sign an NDA that prohibits us from saying something that we want to say about the platforms. Yeah, and I think just realizing that some of these data sets, some of this work that we are doing by philanthropic money, right? Like we're really grateful for the grants that have come through. Ultimately, platforms use all of this data too. And in some ways, we're filling the gap of them having not collected or built effective moderation tools or effective tools for detecting hate speech in misogyny in the first place, right? So I think all of us in civil society are in actually a very tense dynamic right now with platforms, which is that in advocating for the needs of the communities, we'll end up doing some of the work that platforms should be doing in the first place.
Do you see a way how this relationship between big tech and smaller civic organizations which inevitably need to use all these platforms? Do you see the way how this relationship can be reimagined, renegotiated?
Yeah. I mean, so I think for one, there is a concentration of economic power, but also like knowledge, right? Like there is that concentration that has happened in Silicon Valley in tech, which needs to change. And that is like a much bigger conversation. I think specifically in the context of our work, tech companies need to pool in resources and be invested in trust and safety for the sake of the people who are affected by online harms, and not because it meets convenient policy goals and convenient sort of PR goals, right? And I think that's a lot of what happens. So, for example, if there is one jurisdiction where the regulators overactive, platforms will invest a lot in that geography. But then that's not necessarily the people who are most affected by technology, right? So I think how do you get I mean, I think as a technologist who briefly worked at a big tech, right? Like the big question is, how do you in some ways like build that ethic of care in technologists and like in people who work at these big tech companies. And that's not to say that all of them, there are some really well-intentioned and like fantastic people, intelligent people who are trying to do the right thing. But yeah, I think it's something that's going to be worked out in practice. It's not just something, I don't have a great theoretical answer for it. I think this is something like our day-to-day work and our day-to-day organizing we have to figure this out, because in all countries how civic groups engage with platforms also has something to do with how civic groups and platforms engage with governments.
Exactly. And that's also becoming a little bit, um, problematic, especially in the places where with authoritarian governments. But now we see even you don't have to be an authoritarian government. You can be the biggest democracy in the world. Well, we talk about India, but we also talk about the US, right? And look what's happening there.
Yeah.
God. Tarunima, I have $1 million question for you. So, where do you see the future of AI and addressing harmful online content? Are there emerging technologies or approaches that you believe could revolutionize the space?
I think given the volume of content that is online, I don't think there's a future where automation does not, or AI does not play a role in taking down content, right? There's a very significant cost to human moderators going through all the content and labeling whether something is harmful, something is violent, right? There's a significant cost. So I think AI, machine learning, automation is absolutely a part of this puzzle moving forward. How do you get these systems to be responsive? How do you get these systems to work better for regional languages? I mean, again, I think bias is like a beast of a question. It's also something that the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance brought up at the AI Action Summit. It's one of those questions that polarizes everybody, right? Because no machine learning AI that works on social cultural decisions will appear unbiased to everybody. Like there is just no world in which that happens. Yeah, all of these are very difficult questions. But I think for me, for AI to actually be a tool for inclusivity in that it addresses online harms. I want to see a world in which it starts with the most vulnerable populations, but not with the richest populations, right? Because there is in design thinking this idea of designing for the tail, and in designing for the tail, you actually do better for the median or the mean, right? Like if you design for the extreme user, you actually land up addressing the needs of the average user as well, right? So I actually want to see first AI being thought of how does it sensitively address the needs of people who are already in very violent socioeconomic backgrounds and are getting introduced to technology. What does it mean for them? Again, I don't, in my world, there are no silver bullet answers. I think it's always like one, that it is a technology. How does it get embedded in its social context, and how does it get embedded with care?
Let's imagine that someone now who is listening our conversation, they have the same idea that they want to start a civic tech startup to help with some good cause, for society. What would be your life hack for people like that? Yes, how to go about, because you probably made a lot of mistakes and you learned on those mistakes. Like, what is your biggest advice and life hack for people who want to or who work already in this area and on the verge of burnout or something, disillusionment or something? Yeah. What would be your advice to them?
I think one thing I would say is that while we are working with very serious issues, there is some innate sense of like curiosity that we all have about some of these technologies, right? Like these are not technologies that we should be afraid of. These are not, it's not as if our relationship with these technologies is necessarily one of imbalance, right? And I think in our day-to-day lives, we can figure out how to be more empowered with some of these tools, right? So I think something that we encounter often in engaging with civil society is that there's this very adversarial relationship to technology, to platforms, right? And then what lands up happening is that you always have a defensive stance to technology, rather than, so when we're talking about deep fakes, we're saying, oh my gosh, women are going to be affected by AI generated news, and that is correct. Like 98% of content that's deepfake content is pornographic content. But women can also use this technology to create content, right? Like they can also use it in very creative ways. And so I think for me, one of the big shifts that needs to happen is that for us to stop being so defensive about all of this and saying like, no, this is something that I can learn. This is something that I can build with. This is something that's useful for me in my day-to-day life. And then move up from there to say like, okay, how do I build more with this? So it's not a life hack. I think it is an approach. This is just something we've observed. So this is, I guess, something I would like to change in the long run, is for everyone to feel like they can engage with technology, irrespective of what, certain other groups, like certain tech oligarchs might want to say. Like, I think everyone should feel empowered to engage with the technologies and the advancements that are happening right now. I think the other bit for us is that, we have grown very slowly, and perhaps that's not, at least of course for us it was deliberate, but I think for us that's also, or the way I look at it is, you're running a marathon, right? Like you're not running a sprint. So go slow in some ways, right? Let's not hit burnout by trying to do everything at once. Like your life is in conjunction with all of the campaigning, advocacy, organizing that we're doing. and somehow try and keep that like sense of curiosity and wonder alive through all of it. I don't know if that's a great answer. It's a good question that I want to spend more time thinking about, but that's what I would say.
Tell me, what was the most painful lesson learned so far on your journey as a co-founder of this organization?
There's so many, I think there's so many painful lessons. At some point we had a lawsuit where a platform in India was threatening to sue us for collecting data from that platform, and I think I was so unprepared for that. So I think, I mean, I would say a couple of things. Having a co-founder has been the greatest blessing for me. Again, I think when you're trying to go far, doing it with people is always better. It's not, I mean, I guess more than a painful lesson, it's that rely and build networks, right? Like rely and build networks, even though often it feels like we're all competing for the same small and increasingly dwindling set of resources to do civil society work. I think relying and building on networks is quite important. And I think approaching people whether they are at platforms, whether they are in government, right, approaching them with some sense of openness, because people's positions might have shifted just as our positions have as well. I think that's important too. So like the importance of people and networks, I think, has been a good learning lesson. It's not a painful learning lesson. I think the painful lesson is when you don't have them and you realize, oh, you're in a soup, how do you get out of this?
You don't want to be in that position at all, right? But that's a journey, and absolutely you always learn, I guess. So tell me one more thing I'm curious about. So what is your own criteria for success and impact of Tattle? Let's say, I don't know, tomorrow you need to close, or tomorrow something happens and you decide that you will exit from this organization. How would you look at it and you would say, yes, it was it was an impactful thing what I've done. So what is your criteria?
Again, very good questions, because I think this is a feedback that many people will give to Tattle, which is that when you look at our website, it's like, oh, but we're not talking about we have reached 1 million people, we have reached X number of people on any of our services. That's just not how we evaluate success. I think for me, one of the biggest success stories with, say, the Uli project is that we got a bunch of us who might not have thought of ourselves as technically adept came together to create a machine learning tool, and then we sort of turned the process of building a machine learning tool, or machine learning model. So we were very careful about who's collecting the data, who's annotating the data. We were very careful about making sure everyone's recognized. We continue to ask the question of how should people be compensated? How much money is enough money? And if it's not money, then how should people be recognized in these AI value chains, which now with large language models, it's almost like a question that no one's asking. And I think we were slow with it, but somehow we managed to build out this data set. And then the paper, which was an academic paper that we wrote on the data set, got an outstanding paper award at a machine learning conference, right? And so to me, it was one of those bizarre things that, oh, like here were a bunch of people who would have never thought of themselves as AI practitioners, but no, they've actually like written an outstanding paper at a leading AI conference, right? So for me, I think it's in some ways like that's the deeper legacy of like creating alternative imaginations of what is possible. And I think if any of the people we've engaged with come out of engaging like of working with Tattle thinking that, okay, no, like I am empowered to use this technology, for me that is success. And I think my long term sort of, sometimes when I think about like the 5-year 10-year vision, is that like the Ratatouille movie has that scene where it ends with saying that anybody can cook. I think that's how I want people to think of technology, right? Which is that anybody can do this, right? And everybody should do it. And I think that's how we get to more pluralistic versions and imaginations of technology rather than than the dominant one. So that's my like long term view of success.
Well, it's very interesting that because it's in a way criteria of success you kind of what describe now as an organization and as you as a co-founder of this organization. Do you also have your personal criteria? Because you're also a human being, a woman, and let's say years later your grandchildren will ask you, Granny, how did you spend your life? What were those 5-10 years you did this organization Tattle? Did you waste your time, or what? You did not, and you didn't waste your time because of why?
I think, like I said, I absolutely love that I'm able to work with the organizations that I work with, right? And that the cross-disciplinary nature of the work, and to be able to facilitate and to be able to enable that just feels like such an opportunity, because I'm able to learn from all of them. The way I look at it is that technology is my tool. Like, I trained as a computer scientist. I grew up in a household where you could not fall in love with science and tech. And so, but I care about similar issues. I don't have, in some ways, almost like the resiliency to be a first responder. Like, if I think it takes a lot of psychological resiliency and resourcefulness to be the person who picks up the phone when someone says, I have been attacked, and like, I have my nudes online, or like, there's a person harassing me, what should I do? So I don't think that's me, but I think what I can do is use the tools I have, which is technology, right? Yeah, I think my metric of success 10 years later is that if I am, or my personal metric of success, if a grandchild asks, is one, that somehow I was able to advocate for tech to be more human, for tech to be more kind. Yeah, like, say something that we're doing with Uli, when we're thinking very explicitly about compensation, we're thinking very explicitly about recognition, right? If that becomes the de facto way of building systems, that to me would be like such a fantastic legacy to have. So yeah, that would be my personal story of success.
Yes, that would be an amazing legacy. Tarunima, thank you so much. We somehow managed to record this, both being in India. Internet connection is not great. And now somebody is cutting some sort of trees, branches behind my window. So we will hear all sorts of noise. But thank you so much.
Yeah.
It was such a pleasure to talk to you, and wish you all the luck with everything you do in the future, in the nearest future.
Thank you so much, Alora. I'm so happy at the way this ended on a very personal note. But thank you. It made me think a lot.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of AI-FLUENT with me, Ilona Vinogradova, and feel a bit less alone in your newsroom's everyday struggles. This podcast was produced by Love & Films Pro Media Lab. If you would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Share it with your friends and colleagues if you think they might find it useful or inspirational. And if you really like this podcast, review it on your listening app of choice. It will help us to reach more storytellers and make them feel part of a bigger community. I hope you'll join me next time. Until then, take good care of yourself and each other.